What if the moon's arrival was not merely an event in the sky, but a change that the first scribes and builders felt underfoot? You stand in a room of quiet. You listen. I will lead. I will point to dust, to clay, to marks in stone. I will not insist. I will unfold slowly. Where are you now? What time is it where you watch this? Subscribe if you make this a ritual. Stay if you make this a witness. There will be no sudden answers. There will be only careful steps, measurement, and silence. Follow me. Wait with me. Let the unfolding be slow. Begin with the given shape of time. A month in Sumer. Measured, named, inscribed. A premise as steady as sunrise, the calendar as instrument, as rhythm, as structure, wrapping the world in intervals sure enough to gather grain, count days, levy taxes, summon gods, all calculations arranged around a circle of months, counted and recounted, maintained for memory and order. Authority, not in speech, but repetition. Months turning, one after another, in a measured spiral that does not break or slip. That a year's worth of events, its debts and offerings, its tithes and balances, are caught within those recurring labels. That what is due arrives on time. That what is owed is rendered because time itself is rendered. The month is a container, a space for what must be acknowledged. You could imagine the scribe's stylus tracing the expected names, columns growing as regular as irrigation, ditches in the river, plain habit. Usefulness? Faith joined at the wrist, the quiet authority of cycles. The records would echo this confidence, the tally and the date, the shape of order cast in clay. But the tablets themselves do not rest inside that certainty. They arrive instead as a slow, inconstant sequence, a river that stutters, hesitates, pools, and doubles back. Clay strips, sometimes red and sometimes brown, crusted in silt and the hush of long burial, return to the present with marks that refuse arithmetic. Where the calendar promises a ring, the evidence provides a broken line. Traditional month names are written, erased, half erased. New names are slotted in, sometimes between, sometimes overwriting the expected order. Margins once reserved for tallies swelling thick with corrections, unguarded adjustments, hastily added columns, lines running slantwise across grids. The record breaks its own promise of order, and yet the work continues. No explanation appears. What accumulates is not chaos, but layers, a catalogued hesitation stretched over centuries and sites. The months no longer fit inside their names. One scribe alters a line, another copies the altered text, the next modifies the month count again. The evidence moves across hands, repeating the same quiet act of revision. Hesitant strokes layer over surer ones, the pressure of the stylus sometimes feather-light, sometimes pressing through to the tablet's base, ancient fingers hesitating, recommencing, counting again as if numbers themselves had shifted against them. The voice of the record remains neutral. No scribe explains the change. No witness describes an interruption, an outside pressure, a reason why the cycle refused itself. Lines accumulate where the neat ring of months once stood, evidence trailing like the shadow of an untold event. Months expand. 12 become 13. 13 revert. Intercalations bloom, then vanish. Never named by purpose. We are never told what was seen or endured, only that the tally changed. The hands themselves leave little trace beyond the correction. The clay's memory is of numbers, not names. The tablets are fragments, split by time, some scorched, some sifted from walls lost to dust and water. Their script, stylized and practical, keeps to the margins of speech. Each receipt, each reckoning, encoded in wedge-shaped impressions, invokes the presence of order by pointing quietly to its absence. Columns open wide, cataloguing corrections but staying silent on cause. Clay becomes witness, carrying the mute consequence of adjustment through centuries of waiting. The minutiae of calendar change are entered with the same measured calm, the same goosefoot script as the regular months. No urgency, no explanation. The accumulated edits point not to error or oversight, but to something else, a slow, insistent shift that tugs the world out of alignment with its measure. The archive is an accretion, not a narrative, a catalogue of ledgers altered, their surfaces thick with corrections and absences, the patient memory of those who traced and retraced the lines. The evidence advances, receipt after receipt, entry after entry, each fragment joined by the echo of unsettled months. Across sites and centuries, the scattered pieces accumulate, layered in red clay, brown dust, the crust of places where walls once kept out night. The hands that altered counts echo through the tablets, repeating hesitation, nothing defined, nothing certain, just the steady build-up of old corrections. The system it corrects is faded, yet persists across the evidence. Months, names, marks, adjustments, and the silence between them. What emerges is not a narrative of cause, but the weight of interruption. The record does not contend with itself. The archive develops its own gravitational pull, subtly unsettling what had been assumed. Scribes set down corrections, erase, begin again, the facts refusing to resolve. Red clay, brown crust, month after month, hand after uncertain hand. The ring of writing is always incomplete. The catalogue ends. The clay returns to quiet, sleeping under silt and shadow, its surface scored with the traces of uncertain months. Time moves on, the ledgers rest. Their disturbance, left unexplained, becomes a boundary, a point at which expectation failed and the evidence stood still. The cycle is suspended, but the question endures. What does the disturbance in the ledger ask us to keep track of? The landscape once yielded predictability. That was the quiet assumption, along the southern margin of Mesopotamia, in the slow-shadowed drift of the early Holocene. It was supposed, was almost felt, rather than known, that the tides obeyed a measured logic. The sea moved in, the sea withdrew, and the rhythm was gentle, gradual, trustworthy, as a pulse in the wrist of the world. The mud built up in patient increments, quietly accepting what was given. This was the story, the expectation, the way the surface seemed to move in harmony with all it encountered. It held, for a time, then a disruption, not loud, not even immediately apparent, only, in the end, observed by those who cared to look beneath, to slice thin wafers from what the land had kept hidden. Mud pulled from the earth's margin, cored carefully, recorded with a neutrality that left little trace of emotion, only sediment, only the order in the layers. And boredom, a comfort in repetition. Centimetre by centimetre, the laminae repeat in cycles. A mild alternation of silt and sand, neat as if each pass of the water wrote its own line in the archive. Grain by grain, an unbroken rhythm stacks itself, sand and silt, silt and sand. A catalogue of patience and predictable recurrence, until suddenly there is not recurrence but dissonance. The habit of the mud changes. A boundary, thin but undeniable, asserts itself in the record, dividing then from now. The cores preserve it, unspeaking. A horizon drawn not in colour but in the language of order, torn and reshaped. In these moments, description is all that can be safely advanced. Data, not narrative. Layers in the mud, preserved in the cylindrical silence of the core. Laminae stack. Before the break, a choreography of fine particles, gently sorted. Above, the rhythm fractures, beds become graded, their grains untethered from the calm hand that previously arranged them. The observer sees not peace now, but haste. Not a cycle nurtured by predictable tides, but the hurried layering of energy, disorder, change. There is no voice raised, no catastrophe shown in colour or debris, only this profound shift in pattern, an old rhythm broken, a new, insistent sequence pressed into the shallow geology. Foraminifera counted. Always counted tiny witnesses, preserved whole or shattered within the bedding. Before, their communities whispered of estuaries. Low energy, the soft transitions between salt and fresh, a gradient of life adapting to the slow tides. Afterward, the makeup alters without preamble. Markers common to calmer waters recede, replaced by those that tolerate, or even demand, higher energy. More vigorous currents, perhaps more frequent incursions of marine water, or an abrupt reordering of the interface between land and sea. No animation, no illustration of cause, only the relics of adaptation, the pale calcareous changeover chronicled in species identifications, inked in the margins of field notebooks, cross-referenced to global catalogues, the small lives digitized into archives that will never see the river's edge. A single tie point binds these murmurs to chronology. Organic material, a bit of dark matter tightly compressed among the grains, is dated. The methods are always recorded. Conventions of counting decay, calibrating sequence, translating ashes to epochs. The horizon becomes a moment, and the moment frames the before and the after. Still, the mechanism is elusive. Absence, not assertion, fills the void. There is no confident hand to point toward flood, or drought, quake, or surge. Instead, a gentle uncertainty, an unclaimed reordering of depositional practice. The evidence keeps its silence, as if wary of being forced into narrative. There is a tension in the mud. The landscape, it seems, was never only a reflection of human expectation or measurement. Its rhythms, long thought to be charted with confidence, slip away from the mathematics of recurrence and familiarity. Instead, the surface records its own decisions in the language of sediment, breaking cadence without warning or apology. The archival eye only sees what remains after the fact. A disciplined stack, suddenly transformed, offering neither justification nor apology. The people who once measured the tides and placed their trust in continuity found themselves reading a changed script, metering reality against a new and unknowable clock. The core falls silent beyond this point. There are no further ruptures, no further clarifications. The mud, in its layering, holds steady to its reticence, a patience beyond translation. Dust drifts across the remnants of the surface, each season writing and overwriting with a gentle, unhurried hand. The record persists, but it neither interprets nor explains. The past curls upon itself in ambiguity and restraint. The memory is preserved, but the pattern that shaped it is withheld. Where did the new rhythm come from? It is said quietly, authoritatively, that the corals near the Persian Gulf track the slow, steady pulse of the sea. A calendar in calcium, layered patiently at the bright border of water and land. The surface assumption is one of continuity. Year yields to year. Tide follows tide. Energy from the moon's reach captured as subtle expansion, density, and shade. Nature records in patient increments. For a time, perhaps, every growth band is both cause and consequence of the rhythms around it, the tides measuring out a kind of silent equivalence across centuries. The banding is believed to echo undisturbed, marking intervals regular as breath. Then, brought into the open by hands gloved in silt and care, is the evidence the fracture in this continuity, carefully extracted and set aside on white, echoing trays. Samples, earth-stained, are split, sectioned, clean along their axis. Up close, there is an interruption. The bands, until this point so regular as to blend into expectation, suddenly fall into hesitancy. Widths narrow, spacing wavers, the former harmony replaced by abrupt transition. The pulse falters, not with escalation, but with cessation. A stopping. There are horizons now pale and abrupt, like the edge of breath before an exhale now never given. Field logs register these. Places where the coral stopped, where growth paused, stopped, or could no longer keep time. The record holds the marks where living tissue once pressed out into clear water, and then did so no more. It is all here, inscribed in the mineral. The annual banding. Precise yet hesitant, each band tells less as it approaches that horizon, fading into silence, lines converging on cessation. Density is catalogued darker, lighter, inked with difference that neither accuses nor exonerates. In some layers, microerosion makes its claim. Minute scars pocked by ancient currents, softening edges that once were clear. Periods of bioerosion rest above and below these endings. Worm tracks, the feathery signature of unknown mouths, sign the fossil as it exchanges life for memory. Surfaces of dissolution, thin and almost transparent, run across dissolution boundaries, neither fully here nor wholly gone. Every detail is recorded. Uranium, thorium dates, exact to the year, the methodical, indifferent ink of isotope centuries. The numbers find their place among the bandwidths and notations, another set of marks in the careful ledger. The field logs are silent, numbers, notes, sketches, arrows, labeling the intervals of alteration. The cortex is measured, growth rates calculated. Each cessation horizon given its own line in the journal, a thin graphite note. Growth interrupts at the same moment the lower strata on the neighbouring shore harbour the oldest potsherds, fragments of clay pressed into newly made soil. The correlation hangs quietly, unremarked in the register, space left at the margin. There is no essay, only the evidence. All these shapes, these widths and scars, what are they if not a vocabulary of loss? Repeated, rehearsed. The record seems to know that what is missing, what ceases, sometimes carries more weight than what is simply there. Each vanishing band carries with it the intimation not of the ending alone, but of a shift. Something altered the calendar, redrew the marine horizon, and left the coral counting intervals to silence. To stand in the lab, to touch the fossil now bone dry, is to confront this steady, unresolvable pause, a memory trapped in calcite and dust, waiting, yet never petitioning for clarity. There is something unsettling in how the bands align. The pauses in growth echo the depths of strata where the earliest settlements root themselves ashore. As if two records, biological and human, have caught the same hesitation, each inscribing its own silence. The logs list only correspondence, not meaning. The coral stands, silent and precise, observing the centuries go by, marking a period that once was, and then no longer is. The sectioned sample, left beneath the lamp, twice fossilized, twice removed, counts only in absences now. No living witness remains. So it becomes a ritual of observing, recording, and preserving. Each slice of coral is fixed in resin, tagged and logged, preserved in acid-free boxes and darkness. The evidence remains, quietly resistant to explanation, arrayed as a closed ledger beneath glass. The hands that handle it now are distant, elevated only to make an impression, to write another line, to doubt the last. The specimen, fossilized, is a clock that no longer ticks a memory, dry and quiet, hollowed by a pause it cannot voice. What does the interruption in growth align with on the next shore? The learned quiet of the chamber, the stillness of stone in the dark, preserves a prevailing assumption. You enter knowing what has long been believed, that speleothem isotope compositions are loyal translators of the world above. Oxygen, carbon, carried from distant rainfall and steady groundwater, inscribing each year's weather along the hidden spine of mineral growth. It is understood, mostly not spoken aloud, that the rise and fall of these measured values will mirror climatic seasons, echoing the wider beat of regional drought and abundance, warmth and return of rain. The cave is an archive. Its records, in theory, are indexed to the sky's rhythm. To accept this is to hear a simple story, written in stone and water, told over centuries, waiting only for the right hands to read. Yet you hold a fragment now literal, measured, heavy in the palm, a stalagmite, sliced with precision down its growth axis, face gleaming with the dull sheen of carbonates. You see the newly exposed surface, muted in colour, layered in faint bands, the cut revealing epochs pressed close, almost indistinguishable, as if reluctance were inherent. The stone waits, neither confirming nor denying. In measured steps, the protocol unfolds. Micromilled tracks speak to a process stripped of excess movement. Each sample extracted with unavoidable slowness, mapped along the chronology of mineral accumulation. In laboratory silence, glass vials receive the drilled dust. No drama, only residue. Differential scales and slow, practiced hands divide the matter into increments, each one taken from bands that seem, at first, to flow forward in steady, uninterrupted time. But the records begin to assert subtle subtractions and suddenlities. The oxygen isotope ratios, delta values mark excursions. Modest at first, but insistent, their departure does not cleave to the anticipated regional climate archives. The lab notebook, a neutral witness, receives the data without embellishment. 18.0, values tracked across each stratigraphic point, plotted against age model nodes. You record, compare, remeasure. A pause in the sequence appears a band or set of bands more compact, more dense. It does not announce itself, but it is present, a hiatus measured in tenths of a millimeter, a signature of something withheld. Elsewhere in the region, broader paleoclimate curves are already mapped, the hum of consensus audible beneath fossil pollen, lake cores, tree rings. But here, the neat periodicity phrase. This stalagmite's delta values slip sideways, separating from the patterns expected from rainfall and evaporation alone. You note each value into the logbook with care, stating numbers but never interpretation. The columns filling with data points and their associated uncertainties. Laboratory light refracts from the mineral cut, tracing invisible connections across time. No explanation is offered, not even to yourself. The narrative, if one insists on seeing it, is drafted under the discipline of observation. Each growth band, each micromilled sample, each calibrated age point, these are all that can be said. There is a period, not wholly accounted for, in which the stone's memory seems to dry out. The bands thin. The accretion is interrupted. No immediate external forum can be invoked to fill the gap. The chamber itself, insulated from the multiplicity of surface narratives, recalls only what entered in the trickle of subterranean water, not in air temperatures or distant storms. Page after page, the refusal of concordance growing louder. The entries do not tell a story of cause or effect, only of substance, sample positions, isotope readings, age uncertainties. A local groundwater marker steps out of cadence, momentarily independent of the broader orchestration inferred from above. One record, one marker, suspended out of phase, imposes a boundary. The magnitude of departure is marked, noted, left unresolved. The implication is a forcing not easily named, perhaps a change in the timing, duration, or quality of underworld seepage, not merely in the temperature registered miles above. There is no claim of mechanism, no thesis advanced. Merely the shadow cast by dissonance, the silent record of abandonment embedded within the stone. The chamber, returning now to stillness, relinquishes its witness. Stone dries. The measures stop, calendar turns, and silence prevails again, in darkness. No further noise, no further growth, not here. The memory of water endures only in the trace banding, in rising and falling isotope numbers that neither explain nor confess. The drip falls silent, mineral dries, the room resumes its watch. You close the notebook, uncertain. The data remains, mute but dense with implications, testimony to both what happened and what could never quite be heard above the hush. Interrupted the drip that laid down those bands? Begin, as you must, with the assumption. Each ring in the heartwood is more than an integer. Each is a silent ledger of passing years, a sequence of seasons translating sunlight and water into memory. Here, where these trees once grew, the shared belief is a governing one. That this dry land, when uninterrupted by external stresses, fosters a rhythm so regular it can be read as fact. Annually, the pulse of growth is neither hurried nor withheld, increment by increment. Dendrochronology renders these years visible, each ring an axis of time and expectation. Without intrusion, the rings are steady, measured, following the pattern that generations of record keepers rely on. The wood remembers what the living often forget. That time in its natural course is marked by recurrence, not interruption. Yet, time gathers ruins and leaves them for watching. An order once assumed unbroken now wavers beneath the weight of dust and stone. The stability encoded in each ring falters, and the observer, kneeling above ancient timbers, must instead reckon with the evidence that destabilizing sequence, astonishing in its quiet refusal to remain within prior limits. Along the hidden faces of beams pried from rubble, the record fractures. The rings, meant to pace the years, are narrowed abruptly, their widths flickering between plenty and privation. There are false rings, duplications of the season's promise, ghostly echoes pressed where only one should rest. The evidence is not isolated or unique. Instead, it repeats. Matched sequences of these troubled trees recur across site after site, their origins drifted together by the needs of generations long since vanished. So you kneel again, the hush of stones crowding close, and let your eyes pass slowly over ring-width indices inscribed in the margin of a field notebook. Each number is a residue of measurement, the trace of calipers finding the subtle difference from one year to the next. Indices rise and fall, rhythmic at first, then tightening, compressing, breaking expectation. There is uncertainty in the margins. Cross-dates, those parallel harmonics charted across different timbers, do not simply align. They transmit anxiety, a pattern present in multiple sources, as if something unseen pressed upon the seasons all at once, everywhere. Marker years have been noted. Archaic symbols inked beside lines of measurement, no longer quietly blending into rows of ordinary years. A master chronology is assembled, less by confident progression and more by punctuated hesitation, each false ring a footstep in a corridor grown dark. No final cause is marked. No hand writes an explanation in the space beside the evidence. The record keeper, present only in the marks they leave behind, carries forward the tradition of restraint. The wood is offered as it lies, under rubble, stripped of its bark, its layers exposed but unrevealing. You are told only what is preserved between the stones, where absence is as important as what remains. There is no invitation to conclude, only to listen closer to the interruption in the Song of Seasons, each pause refracted through overlapping contexts. What should have been a simple calendar becomes a palimpsest of hesitation, your finger moving helplessly from ring to ring, tracing both interval and anomaly. Silence persists between the lines, an unanswered echo. Here, the surface of a timber, polished, its growth rings luminous under diffused archival light. Here, the record laid bare for scrutiny, tools measuring and remapping the old certainties. The evidence accumulates its own gravity, drawing thought and memory to the threshold of knowing, never quite crossing. It endures as an unresolved record, the outline of absence sharpened with each measured interval. Once, these trees counted the years methodically, their sequencing trusted to stand in for all other vanished watches. Now the tally stumbles. The years counted are not the ones expected. The bark is gone, the living edge is lost. Yet beneath the rubble the rings endure, in order, their silence undiminished despite what is missing. Human hands shaped these beams, set them in construction, then time, indifferent, brought the layers down, mingling growth and ruin. Still, the evidence does not settle. It circles back, insistent, recurring as a tension threaded through both chronology and debris. Only the discipline of returning and returning again to the marks, the narrowed bands, the doubled rings, the intervals that refuse both erasure and explanation. One season gave way to another, as always, but the record shows a new cadence, undecided and unresolved. You remain with the wood, the evidence a kind of silent companion, its memory partial and its story incomplete. Once counted as certainty, they now ask to be considered as artifact, nothing less, nothing more. It is said, almost as if the words were nature's own law, that shells, when discovered in ancient totals, signal the margin where land and tide meet and exchange. This, for years, has seemed as stable as the tides themselves, an unbroken doctrine, middens of shell cluster, on salt-struck ledges where water draws away and then returns again, when such shells occur far inland when they surface in dust or clay. Underneath dry horizons, the explanation long settled into a single groove. They were brought, transported, perhaps for ritual, for trade, for ornament or use, by hands that still leave traces in the ground. In this schema, the interior is landlocked in both body and meaning. Only human purpose can move the sea's debris into the heart of the continent. This was the way, or so it seemed, the world held its boundaries between shore and settlement, each keeping to its own sphere, unless acted upon by deliberate, documented choice. Yet there are fragments that do not rest easy within this assurance. The records grow in their strangeness, quietly, over years of excavation and dust. Stratified deposits, full of shells, some crushed, some whole, none, in context that makes immediate sense, lie exposed beneath layers that speak only of earth and forest. The first incision is simple. A wall of soil revealed, bands and pockets described in passing. Then, unexpectedly, marine shells glint against the ochre, neither scattered nor sporadic, but gathered in bands, pressed into the record. The surface is dry, the depth unremarkable, but here are species whose place belongs elsewhere. Small bivalves, their hinges unbroken, spiral gastropods, some still cupping traces of their last marine silt, oysters, rarely, notable for their unweathered surfaces and faint salt trace within the laminae. They are not ceremonial accumulations, not jewellery, not curated or adorned. The surface marks, the pressure of silt, the matrix in which they are embedded, all speak more to disposal than display, discarded maybe, or left. The catalogue inventories them without flourish, species named in the same hush as other refuse. Dimensions entered, matrix texture recorded with a kind of indifferent care. In some strata, the shells are crushed beneath thicker earth, tending towards fragmentation but not absence. In others, they rest intact, ensconced as if the land has protected their shape from the grinding of time. Scattered charcoal, granular clay, rootlet traces, bulk density. No clear evidence of fire or burial or trade, only the persistent, measured presence of marine life now sealed below. Osteological catalogues, drafted in dust and quiet, expand the record without deepening the story. The shells are measured, drawn, logged, preserved in latex bands and cardboard trays. Each line, each entry, is another gesture towards control, and yet it is silent on purpose. There is no assertion, no annotation in block graphite that will trouble the page with motive. Here are the shells, here is their matrix, here is their level, preserved as the earth fanned back from the wall. That is all. The deeper accumulation offers neither drama nor finitude. The old assumption shell, as a coastal thing, an edge thing, a matter for communities beside the sea, runs quietly against this measured, unyielding presence far inland, with no exegesis to accompany it in the written record. Yet, in this refusal to declare intention, the evidence itself becomes its own event. The imagined witness stoops in dim light to note the arc of a broken hinge, the gritty swirl where silt and shell have merged, the minor collapse of a layer that has rested undisturbed for seasons out of mind. The sound is only slate against brush, the quiet scraping of a trowel, the near silence of ancient discard. In this silence, the shells are both specific and strange, their very persistence, a reminder of difference. What sits above is terrestrial, a long compression of humus and root, the calm of centuries' accumulation, and yet below, in a sequestered layer, the sea has sent its remnants here. Not recently, no open channel or known floodplain, no misdirected delta, only the enduring, patient catalogue of what rests, composed and then discovered by hands, tracing the profile of a midden thought to be only of land. The layers speak, perhaps, only because they persist and can be seen distinct from one another, bounded by muted colours and minor discontinuities, punctuated by shells from the sea. What does the silent archive mean? If meaning is only ever the residue of events once permitted to happen, if the earth, made new with each slow deposition, simply inherited the sea's cast-offs by a process not written, not remembered, not willed by reason or deed, no direct evidence of ritual, none of commerce. Neutral description prevails, a refusal to fill the absence with certainty, letting only the matrix and composition remain. This is marine life. These are shells, found here, far from the reach of tide. You find yourself returning to the same threshold, circling back to the layered evidence, what remains, what can be recorded again and again, until repetition itself forms a kind of knowledge. The sea's life, lying now under clay, holding in its spiral or valve a question louder for its restraint. Is this the voice of a forgotten shoreline, or merely the trace left behind by something unaccounted for, silent, except for the evidence of its aftermath? How did the shells of ocean creatures come to lie in the inland earth, speaking nothing but layers upon layers of their impossible presence? The prevailing assumption endures quietly, like mortar beneath stone. In this temple, it is said, foundations were rebuilt to enact renewal, to mark a new calendar, or to reinforce stability where ritual calendars turned over and stones bore layered burdens of the past. The ground was thought secure, the intent affirmed renewal in the service of order, a clean axis drawn across centuries. Builders returned, not for necessity but for the right. A sanctuary remade, ritually and politically grounded by human design. So the legend drifts downward, lodging within earth and expectation, a datum against which all else is measured. Yet in the half-light of a trench exposed, under the careful hands of record-keepers and shadows of absent priests, the assumption quiets. What is written is not always what is found. Under the surface, a sequence emerges, foundation, refoundation. But these are not straightforward layers. The earth does not yield to tidy interpretation. Instead, there are trenches that cut through the old, packed fill, battered and poured at different angles, depths shifting not as a single intention, but in a slow mosaic, each deposit responding to something unseen. Here, the memory is housed in plan drawings, crisp, incremental traces of form sketched above damp soil. The field ledger records dates and orientations, notations neither hurried nor fully explained. A section line runs through calcified clay, halts, then returns again, slightly incurved, pressing the threshold of what the ground will hold. Mason marks, some clear, others effaced by damp or friction, appear and vanish without recital. Mortar is sampled, flaked and tested. One stratum pale, sugar white. Another grayed by some lingering admixture. Its composition entered among other traces on the page. To walk the sanctuary's remains is to navigate a palimpsest. The original ground, expected to be stable, reveals a choreography of hesitation and adjustment. Each new attempt at renewal overlays intent with compromise. Nothing remains linear or fixed. The axis, once assumed, wavers underfoot. Where one would expect a decided orientation east-north, appeasing some celestial marker, it bends fractionally. Packed subsoil gives way to looser earth and returns again. The sanctuary's sequence is not claimed by any single alignment. Descriptions from above do little justice to the discontinuities felt within the trench. The uneven resistance of old clay, the abrupt change from deep-packed fill to a shallow, disturbed shelf, the way depth itself becomes ambiguous, mapped and then remapped with each spade's cut. Memory here wears the mask of enumeration. In the ledger, each reading of depth, each annotation of slope and edge is precise but never explanatory. The language of notes, layer undulating, trench turns at midpoint. Mortar grade coarse, offers neither cause nor pattern. It is the rigor of record, not the clarity of narrative. The observer's hand is restrained. The evidence is allowed to speak, muffled by time, nothing imposed that the earth does not first show. No direction is ascribed, no motive preserved. What compelled the change, the axis redrawn, depth shifted, the house returned always to its clay remains outside the text. Still, the silences matter as much as the written traces. The priests are gone, their rites unrecorded. The blueprint, once pored over in sun or lamplight, now lies flattened, creased by years and dust. No voice urges reason for the work, nor justifies the effort spent in realigning walls or consolidating loam. The motive is not assigned and cannot be reconstructed. Not with mortar scraped and tested, not with elevations traced and erased. This absence becomes another kind of data, a void in the archive, a blank column in the ledger. The shifting orientations overlapping, interrupted, rarely resolved, press a question against the presumption of renewal. Was the ground itself unsteady, whispering instability beneath their feet, demanding constant attention, endless negotiation? Or did sightlines change as horizon itself altered, drawing a new axis that no calendar could predict, indifferent to orthodoxy? In these records, the implications hover without ever settling. The evidence does not relinquish its ambiguity. It resists translation. There is tension at the limit of material and memory, a slow recalibration, never quite concluded, never finally interrupted. The mortar dries unevenly. Drafts swirl through empty corridors where roof and wall once converged. All that persists are traces, notes written, forms redrawn, sediment pressed and reprised by those who endured in silence. If each return to the sanctuary was shaped not by renewal or decree, but by an uncertain negotiation with ground and gaze, the blueprint now rests in dust, its true axis veiled among faded lines and nameless marks. What compelled builders to shift the axis of that house of clay? Assumption proceeds quietly, often unchallenged, a steady rhythm beneath centuries. Towers, stone-bound and silent, set their faces to the horizon. It is accepted, almost with reverence, that their vast forms, their layered heights, speak to a single celestial address, a fixed marker in the vault of sky, immutable, waiting at dusk or dawn. The lines of their massive platforms, the measured stride of each course, the regular echo of ancient footsteps across brick and dust, all presumed to be in alignment with something constant, something intended with certainty at the moment of laying the first angle. The monumental orientation is itself a declaration. Here is direction, here is order, here is a purpose, just beyond the grasp of word or record, held in the geometry of stone and shadow. You walk in the long shade of the ziggurat and suppose, as others have supposed, that it faces what it always meant to face. Yet the archive offers its counterpoint. Records emerge, understated and precise, destabilizing in their patient accumulation. The excavation logs, in orderly script, preserve the numbers. An azimuth measured, then another still, each belonging to a different construction phase. Alignments drift by degrees a handful at first, less than the breadth of outstretched fingers, then more than a body's width when centuries are spanned in the span of parchment. The surveys, running parallel to stone and horizon, sketch the bearings once and return later, only to find the line has changed. Successive episodes of construction, demarcated by sediment and colour, by seams in masonry, and the quiet arrangement of fill layers, betray subtle turns. Amid the dust of each epoch, the walls diverge, never wildly, never in chaos, but with a measured uncertainty, incremental and persistent. Note horizon markers with the discipline of those who know their witnessing is fleeting. A lone rock, a notch where earth meets sky, the faint echo of a mountain shape remembered only because its outline is drawn in a field notebook. Bearings captured in compass degrees, not the language of myth or ritual, but of calculation. There is restraint in their accounts. The teams mark what can be observed, what can be triangulated with string and rod against the receding light. Their silence holds as much weight as their notation. No speculative arrows point to planet or star. No interpretation interrupts the record. The monument holds its angle. The note holds its question. All that is presented is what survives. A platform's course that shivers from the intended path, a foundation misaligned by a nearly imperceptible margin, measured by careful hands generations removed from intention. Compass readings are transcribed beside layer designations. North by east in one, a hair closer to north in the next, always with a footnote for uncertainty. The logs oscillate between precision and humility. Here the bearing is certain. Here it fades to error, obscured by erosion or collapse. The stones themselves do not answer. They are repositories of weight and silence, giving nothing but the angle at which they rest, the shadow they throw near sunset, the stubborn persistence of their presence. No eye is given to the matter of why. Instead, the emphasis returns, steady and repetitive, to the how of alignment, to the what of measurement. The construction episodes stack, both in reality and in paper, each a threshold between before and after, between presumption and record. In the transition between phases, in the incremental turning of each new platform, something remains behind, unnamed. What the earliest builders marked on the sky is not described. What the later hands saw when they corrected by a fraction is recorded but not interpreted. The only evidence is the slow curve traced by walls over centuries, a pattern not marked as pattern, only observed in silence. If constant, the target should persist. If persistent, the drift should not occur. The evidence suggests neither, but does not speak decisively. The alignment records themselves are the only narrative. Each course in stone is a moment anchored to a vanishing horizon. Each entry in a survey log a brief resting place between epochs. The lacunae are as striking as the numbers. The absence of certainty, the gap between intention and observable fact. What remains is an architecture of memory, measured but not explained, a shadow at the threshold of understanding. And so the site waits, its stones and ledgers paralleling each other, each whispering about a correspondence now lost or shifted. The sun sets as it always has, the walls receive its last light. The recorded measurements remain unchanged on the page. Over generations, the relationship between monument and horizon has moved, whether by movement in the land beneath or in the sky above, is withheld by the evidence itself. One aligns, again and again, and yet the marker recedes. What did they see change? If all that endures is the measure, one presumes stasis. The crescent, incised into clay and stone by the ancient hand, is a cipher transmitting continuity through dust and rain and custodial change. Tradition holds that iconography, delicately arrayed on the rolled surface of the cylinder seal, stands outside the current, neither swayed by fashion nor subject to the whims of passing custodians. It sits a silent symbol presiding over columns of records, contracts, names impressed and re-impressed across generations. There is comfort, perhaps, in believing the motif is stable, that the language of images was meant to outlast the transient matters it marked. In this view, the crescent and its silent attendants are an unchanging arch, a bridge pressed into the soft, impressionable surface of daily administration, anchoring all that flows beneath. A corpus emerges, not just one, nor a scattered handful, but a sequence, coherent in its chronology, confined within the careful boundaries drawn by cataloguers' hands. A transformation appears, subtle but undeniable, moving in stages across the surface of these seals. The crescent is no longer singular. It falters, adjusts, withdraws from its original pose. Its attendants accumulate, dwindle, alter their forms or drift farther from the center. Rolling outward, the motif grows unsteady, its boundaries shifting within the continuum of its assigned visual role. What is observed? The cut of the incision sometimes deep and certain, at other times shallow, a hesitant interruption in mineral flesh, paste residue caked in the triangulated intersections, courting the absent colour of things once vibrant, but now ash-grey and voiceless. The finds are boxed, compact in their inventory. They arrive with tags, the numbers blunt, the handwriting distant. Each seal boxed, each motif awaiting an impartial eye, never a verdict. The crescent recurs, but repetition cracks. Silence hovers between iterations, as if something has been withdrawn or set in flux. The catalogue marks what can be claimed. The motif, rendered again and again, accompanies not a legend or a pronouncement, but the neutral observation's depth, measured to a millimetre, crust analysed and noted. The residue not brushed, but listed. The find spot too is listed, sometimes with the precision of a modern survey, sometimes trailing uncertainty in the absence of a settled context. The motif is present, then altered, then present again, impression after impression, entered into record with the same unwavering detachment. No claim is placed on what the crescent signifies. No meaning is inferred in the margins. The hand of the recorder is still. The record remains as it is. Motifs in series, depths, residues, coordinates. Motif, incision depth, paste residue, fine spot, each held at arm's length, suspended between knowledge and the safe edge of observation. Not explained, not named, but visible if one runs their eyes slowly along the recorded line. Within the closed system of administrative utility, the visual language adjusts. The constraints are tight, the administrative context transparent in its limits. One notes that something was seen, or perhaps allowed to be seen. A signified object thought stable is instead revealed as variable, shifting beneath the surface of standardized workflows. The motif records an event or series implied, not explained, a crescent that was there, or was altered, or was lost, and the record that traces, then hesitates, then lets go. Rolled out, the seals reveal both insistence and retreat. The motif, in its recurrence, marks sameness, refracted through phase and shadow. The boxes stow these artifacts in orderly silence, their surfaces touched only by conservation gloves and the uncertain intent of distant eyes. Over time, boxes are stacked, catalogues thickened, and the evidence enters a deeper silence. Even the catalogue, with all its clarity, fails to rescue the vanished intervals, the moments when the symbolism shifted but was neither named nor explained. The administrative records persist, neither resolving nor quite preserving the change. Each witness, a record keeper, a scribe, an excavator, a modern cataloguer, adds only what can be measured, weighed, listed. The motif shifts, and that alone is treated as fact. Layers of neutrality accumulate. Meaning is not assigned, the sense of loss unvoiced. And yet, it is there, in the silence, following each entry, in the box dust, in the almost imperceptible arc of alteration. Time passes. The motif endures in the archive, rolling and unrolling in the mind's eye, an echo of its function and its failure to remain unchanged. The crescent, once certain, is now trembling, a motif repeating, breaking, reforming in shallow incision and deep silence. Meanwhile, the sky itself changes beyond the reach of these records, and the sign that was once enough is no longer held by the same meaning. What mote of sky did the image record and then let go of? It was once assumed quietly, persistently, that the fish within these coastal deposits would tell a slow story of change, that the assemblages, lying in layers beneath the crumbling topsoil, would reflect only the gradual curve of practice. Perhaps the patient refinement of methods along the water's edge. Assumption becomes sediment, a layer pressed by time and repetition. To read these sequences was to encounter stability, interrupted only by the steady pulse of the tides or the sweep of familiar hands through the shallows. Fish, then, as the silent participants in a pact between humans and the coastal landscape, not changeless, but changing in step. Beneath this layered confidence lies disruption. The evidence reveals itself not with force, but in careful interruption, first noted as a pattern under the pale lamp of the laboratory. A stratified change, held in the cold clarity of numbers, begins its soft insistence. Species once dominant recede, replaced in unsettling rapidity by others less familiar. The record is unembellished counts, weights, portions of bone preserved and catalogued, their provenance traced to kitchen floors now cooled and stilled. It is within these sequential kitchen deposits that the transformation stands, not as a single event, but as a gradual rearrangement impossible to dismiss. The soup of time and fire divides the record into before and after. Hands turn over the fragments, vertebrae, opercula, spines and jaws, each catalogued and weighed, each aligned to its accession number in the catalogue. The bones of one layer press under the bones of another, sometimes compacted, sometimes scattered, their edges sharp or ground to powder by centuries of movement. The anatomy speaks in percentages, a proportion shifting, a size class fading into another. In some trays, large fish diminish as the levels climb, replaced by bones so slight they must be coaxed from the sifted dust. Yet the record refrains from finality, no voice from within the ash, no explicit claim that these bones alone can explain the movement of tides or the shifting shore. There is first what is seen. There is a count, the number of bones belonging to one species outcropping like a shelf, then subsiding, a tally of weights, small increments noted on datasheets, offering little beyond their own assertion. There are anatomical dispersals, fragments arrayed across the catalogues, some nearly complete, others little more than dust and form reduced by successive hands. Under the lights, rows of accession numbers track passage, a code for a hearth, a site, a context, a season lost to memory. It is possible to speak only of the pattern, the arithmetic of absence and arrival among the trays. Hands record and sift. Silence gathers in the spaces between. Each count, each bone, each weight, a tether to what once swam, what once shimmered alive between silt and current. And so, the tension accumulates. For all the careful notation, for all the confidence embedded in the order of catalogues, what appears within these deposits resists the neat alignment of story and intent. The marine resource base, once imagined as an extension of choice or necessity, reorganizes without full invitation or warning. The bones do not testify to motive, nor to external force, they merely recite themselves in altered sequence. Human selection is inscribed in the refuse. Yet another presence moves between the margins, the margin of fish, the margin of memory, the margin of what is now lost beyond the laboratory's reach. Within the cooled hearths, deposition lingers as ash and echo. To excavate is to sift through dimness, each context sampled, each sample labelled, each label echoing the absence of an original witness. The kitchen floors, so recently alive with the routine of preparation, are rendered silent, their story told only by what can be coaxed from below. The measured anatomical fragments are boxed and stored, consigned to shelves whose order is their only confession. The passage from meal to record, bone to number to tray is slow but irreversible. In the archive, silence thickens. Here are the remains that cannot say why the margins shifted, why the fish offered up in one stratum are not those left behind in the next. There is no claim to causality, only the honest recitation of change. Each context, each fragment, marks a threshold crossed but not explained before, then after, never quite resolved. You draw back from the trays, from the dim ledger glow, from the patient hush of the archive, and the question hovers, nearly unspoken. What altered the margins that fed those meals? The expected order holds. Incised marks along the rim or shoulder of household pottery are, and have long been considered, simple tally devices, numbers pressed into wet clay to reckon daily outputs, to follow the arithmetic steps of routine production. Each incision, it seems, a unit, a stroke, a token of what was made or kept or counted. The assumption is quiet, near automatic, tracing the arc of labour across the surfaces of these unremarkable pots. The marks settle into the gentle logic of accumulation. With each vessel, the impression remains of hands repeating tasks, marks anticipating their summation. Yet close at hand, the evidence accumulates in a different shape. Trays lined with the dust of generations receive a fragile core of potsherds. Their surfaces bear not just isolated notches, but sequences, patterns of repetitive incisions clustered along the rim and body, marks pressing into one another, with a rhythm that resists known systems of reckoning. Some tally, perhaps, but never in the predictable cadence of familiar numbers. Instead, the marks gather into intervals, breaks disrupting rhythm, clusters repeating in cycles that do not tally up, but rather echo. Disorder inside apparent order, the routine suddenly unfamiliar, its meaning elusive. The disruption is steady and unvoiced. Each sherd is entered into pottery registers, note after note, neutral and consistent. mark counts recited in sequence 3, 5, 4, 1, 2, 6. A steady recitation of number without context. Placement is tracked. Rim, shoulder, occasionally base. Vessel forms are enumerated. Storage jars, domestic bowls, the shapes worn by daily use. The context enters as sediment, stratigraphic level, trace mineral content pressed into columns. The recording eye, trained on emergence and contrast, notes powder caked on rims, the fine residue of soil that held the fragments for seasons, for decades, sometimes more. Each line in the register, patient and impartial, carries the sherd further from the hands that shaped it. There is no theory pressed by these records, no economic calculation, no assigned function, only the surface of fact. No projection is made. The marks are described as they are, not as they might have been. Preserving a humility in the face of the unknown, the accounting must resist temptation, settling into description, letting the rhythm fall where it may. Instead, it sits, unresolved, in the middle of the page, the tally marks beside the counts. No hypothesis pressed, no resolution broached. Still, it is the silence that interrupts most strongly. The sherds lie in trays, unremarkable in their arrangement, but bearing silent intervals, the space between each notch, the hesitation before the next incision. One is led to notice the irregularities, the repetition where none is required, the fractured series that hints at a rhythm never fully notated. These are not simply devices of economic memory, then, but perhaps a record of some external order, some observation kept regular by more than calculation. It is not said. The register only records, the analyst only enters. The possibility remains and persists in the tactile memory of the mark. Time, too, works its own tally. The earth's sediment powders over the marks, softening their edges, making the notches ambiguous and the intervals indistinct. The hands that impress the clay are gone, their sequence is lost, and only the sherd remains, bearing its resistant evidence. The evidence holds presence and absence alike, what is recorded and what is left unsaid. In the trays, the dust settles, the marks repeat, the silence is never absent. It is pressed into every interval, every fragment, every rim, now fragile, under the brush of the present. No observer recalls these marks being made. No witness writes in the register why the sequence doubled before breaking off, why the rhythm slipped and gathered, why the same hand circled back to the same spot. Only the evidence remains, and the register that faithfully attends to its details, neither confirming nor denying, only reciting. It is a threshold. Before, vessels in daily use. After, fragments inscribed with something more restrained, more difficult to name. Now, they are entries, numbers, placements, and forms the record holding back what cannot be described. Their sequence is visible, their substance intact enough to demand the patience of observers, the discipline of recorders, the indifference of registers. Their purpose remains a series of intervals, of silences layered upon silences. The evidence settles, the question left, unresolved, marking the edge of what you can know. There is a prevailing comfort in patterns. The field of stones, unbroken, promises that the ledger of the dead is orderly, transparent, and reflects the rhythms of society turned over years and generations. Demographic profiles constructed from rows of marked earth offer the assurance that mortality follows expectation, that social structure leaves its quiet signature in the alignment of bodies and the distribution of lives reached and lost. The observer, trained to read age at death distributions as a language, finds reassurance in numbers. Most pass in youth, many in the struggle of adulthood, some beyond into a weathered old age. Regularities persist, just as the profile remains largely unchanged from grave to grave, epoch to epoch, each dataset anchoring a faith that nothing interrupts the procession except time itself. Sometimes there are fractures in this imagined continuity. The assumption trembles, quietly, beneath the surface, as one cemetery whispers an anomaly into the orderly archive. Here, the distribution is altered. The span of years between first breath and final rest contracts, markedly, and within a narrow interval, too compressed to be explained away as mere chance. Statistical certainties begin to fray when, excavation after excavation, subadults, those between the liminality of childhood and the yet unreached threshold of maturity, accumulate in numbers that resist alignment with established expectations. A disproportion emerges, persistent, undeniable, nonetheless only half acknowledged in the ledgers. The regular pulse, the unspoken agreement between past and present that organizes death. Excavation forms, dull with repetition elsewhere, stutter unexpectedly. An abrupt change in burial goods is entered, carefully, without interpretation. The neutral hands that sift soil and artifact record the shift without embellishment. The inventory shifts from stones to beads, or beads to absence, or metal to clay, yet the sequence is rendered without commentary. The observer, again, is invited to notice without conclusion, to sit with the discomfort that not all shifts declare their origin. The official osteological report, untouched by mourning or narrative, lists where epiphyseal closure and the gentle erasures left by disease. Catalogue numbers, each mapped to a set of bones, are matched to discrete lines on a page. There, the observer may search for clues. The arch of a pelvis not fully fused, a long bone truncated by growth uncompleted, an enamel crown marred by lines of arrested development. There are femurs whose growth plates remain open, vertebral bodies where age can only be guessed. The pathologist messages the silent indicators into columns where much less than expected. Pathological markers too youthful or too few. There is an absence of trauma, no mass grave, no great heap, no declaration of violence, just the subtle testimony of arrested maturation, an unfinished tally of lives. The record is not haunted by narrative, but by what fails to materialize. Demographic data, stilled in a table, resist the urgency to explain. The forms are without inference, withholding intention. Even in their neutrality, they mark a moment. There was a change. The before marked by broad age dispersal, by the slow accumulation of adulthood, by the lived variety of dying, the after a blink, a narrowing, the quickening of interment of the young. These are boundaries set by intervals rather than events, by distributions rather than declarations. A sideways pattern rests inside the material remains. The remains do not explain themselves. The residence pattern, the 12 and the observer is left only with what is visible and measurable, stitched in silence to absent reasons. The forms close. Each grave, once open and read, is again covered over, as if the weight of soil could settle mystery as well as memory. Still, under the mud and rock, the bones rest, unknowing. The questions are neither amplified nor erased by time. Instead, they become sedimented, pressed into the slow forgetting of landscapes that once hosted the everyday movement of lives. Is it possible to register change without advancing cause? The attempt is made. Dental enamel read for lines and lapses, the geography of joints charted, the arrogation of pathology matched to year and sex. Yet the answers do not accumulate, only the evidence. The pulse of those who lived here is not betrayed by narrative, but by the choreography of their interment. The environment, the architecture, and the material cast align with the silent rows, coexisting with the outlying interval, holding evidence of destabilization but never its source. You are returned, always, to the same tension, the contrast of what was expected against what was recorded, the disquieting interval in which the foundations shift but refuse to reveal themselves. Lived bodies experienced a temporal change. The bones do not resist, nor do they signal the means by which patterns were upturned. Absence recalibrates the data, the silence between catalogue numbers becoming the most resonant statistic of all. Time closes itself around the graves. Night deepens over the burial ground, enfolding secrets in stone, in dust, in the spaces between stones. The record, careful and restrained, does not trouble itself with answers. Only this quiet accumulation of evidence remains, still and suggestive. A pulse, both muted and inexhaustible. What pulse altered the distribution of those lives? There was once a calmness in the way the evidence was handled, a simplicity in the working assumption that told its own quiet story. Metallurgical slag, pitted and dark, and the silent lines of shaped metal, resting cold in drawers or display, were the inevitable trace of a steady hand. In this story, the supply was reliable, the production cycles measured and understood, the rhythm of metalwork mirroring the rhythm of those who held it, a process predictable, returning to itself across hours and seasons, leaving behind these mineral ghosts. There was, or so one allowed oneself to believe, an enduring reliability to the making and remaking of the world in metal. The anvil's mark was unvarying, the slag's composition familiar. To observe was, for a long time, to confirm. Yet something shifts when the evidence is read again. The simple arrangement quiets and is replaced by a more fragmented trace, disquieting in its quiet refusal to align. Alone in the archive, beneath low, dust-bleached lights, the smelting debris and the ingots begin to speak with their own voices, not loud, but uneven in their register. Their chemistry reveals something other than constancy. The lab's reports, dry and impersonal in their notation, begin to record a disturbance, an unexpected divergence. It is seen first as isotopes, like faint ghost rhythms in the heart of the metal. The lead isotope ratios, once clustered closely, now part and regroup in unfamiliar patterns. Trace element signatures, unruly, resist the narrative of seamless progression. Marking both measurement and memory, the evidence grows in clarity and ambiguity, in equal measure. Each sample is inscribed with a date, a horizon marked both in strata and in catalogue number. The ppm concentrations, measured out with error margins, exhaustively recorded but never fully deciphered, stand as patient counters of unseen processes. In the quiet presence of these containers, glass, polyethylene, labelled in neat hand or fading type, the artifacts and slag reside, locked in their respective compartments. What was once evidence of a stable cycle now falls into a cryptic rhythm. The debris clusters uneasily. The isotopic record slips sideways. The trace elements refuse to overlap as they once did. All of this noted, cross-referenced, preserved against the forgetfulness of time. It is hard to know if the ones who observed first recognized the implications, or if the silence pressed harder against their conclusions. The provenance files, themselves archival relics, oscillate between detail and omission, foregrounding both the care and the uncertainty with which these records were kept. It does not assert, it only describes high lead, low silver, isotopic deviation at 207 petabytes, 206 petabytes ratios, stratigraphic variance noted at the boundary. Each entry an island, adrift amid a growing sense of discontinuity. The anvil is unmoving, the forge long since cooled, but the chemistry endures, unyielding to habit or hope. As the cycles of supply and production fall under closer scrutiny, the chemistry resists offering its reassurance. No economic, no geological mechanism lies behind the figures, not here, not yet. The numbers form patterns, and then unform, dissolving into the sediment of what cannot be certain. The figures remain disentangled from cause. All that is seen, the metals, their isotopic voices grouped and then ungrouped, signatures reconstituted at the horizon. The horizon itself is not a line, but an interval stretched thin across stratified sediment. If one stares long enough, what comes forward is not explanation, only sequence. A quiet shift, a muted difference, preserved without motive. Those who kept the records marked these transitions with the same inscrutable patience, sometimes in silence, sometimes noting only a bracket, a question left unanswered in the margin. The room is thick with what is left unwritten. You feel the presence of absence. The chemistry becomes a kind of shadow narrative, one that marks time not by events, but by the refusal of materials to remain as they were. The lab samples, numbered and relabeled, track a movement that does not announce itself. The debris, untouched and undisturbed in its stratigraphic rest, tells a version of the past that escapes recital. What really changes is not seen at the surface, but in the ratios, the signatures, the arrangement of silence that follows the sequence in the data. The pattern reveals itself in the refusal to be pattern. Night moves in around the record, and the only answer left is the continued presence of the evidence itself. In quiet rooms, under patient lights, you become attuned to the echo that follows when the metal's provenance no longer aligns with its own past. The silence swells, and the dust in the archive settles. The evidence waits. You remain a witness. What changed the metal's provenance the way it did? There is a belief that takes shape almost effortlessly, as if carried downstream by the river itself. In textbooks, in notebooks, in the spoken habits of field instructors, it emerges and settles. The river delta grows with predictable patience, its margins extending year by steady year. The upstream load, silt-laden and persistent, whispers in arithmetic calculations of time and volume, expectation and order. There is a rhythm assumed here, a simplicity that comforts. The delta, it is thought, is built by the regular submission of carried matter, deposited according to rules written in the quiet chemistry of water. This is what the models require, what the plotting of levels and profiles seems to affirm. It is easy to believe that change, if it comes, does so with propriety, and that the land's rearrangement is always foreshadowed by incremental drift. The ground testifies to other arrangements, always the river, but never quite as expected. You take up the cross-sections, disciplined measurements transferred into ruled notebooks, pages fragile and flaking with the residue of silt. There, among pencil lines and fevered numbers, something distinct emerges: suddenness. The clean expectation of uniform accretion becomes cross-cut by facts that resist explanation. Channel avulsion appears in the notations, clipped and unadorned, a veering of lines where none was supposed to be. The handwriting falters. There is a pause in the surveys. Someone, once, wrote a question in the margin and then scratched it out, leaving a silence where the answer might have gone. Stratigraphic profiles do not smooth the picture. Instead, they thicken it. Slabs of sandy loam, sliced from the earth with care, show sudden differences. Light falls obliquely across the exposed section. Layers tilt, truncate, resume. Residual roots, compacted dark and light, signal episodes of rapid burial. At the margins of a cross-bedded package, you trace an abrupt change in orientation and colour. This is not the stately layering of undisturbed times. Here, the layers stutter. Each break is a hesitation, an interruption left unfilled by commentary or cause. The exposed section does not speak, but it suggests. The process of description is slow, repetitive, almost reverential. Bed forms, ripple marks, wave-dragged ridges, small humps and scours, each measured, drawn, set beside the next in a record that admits nothing but data. Along the main section, someone has logged grain size, moving from coarse to fine, then coarse again, odd repetitions noted in passing. These sequences hold their own tensions. The grain sizes, hinting at changes in flow. The boundaries sharp, as if an unseen hand pressed pause and then fast-forwarded the river itself. Lenses of silt interrupt the sand. Here, a faint band of organic matter, darker than the encasing sediment, labelled in an old-fashioned hand. A sample bag once pressed flat against this surface, its number matching the entry in the register. The number persists. At intervals, horizons are marked. Organic lenses, mottled root traces, the withered imprint of what may have been a brief inundation of grass or sedge. Always, the labelling is careful, and always the tone remains neutral. No single episode is blamed, nowhere is a culprit named. In the ledger of samples, you find no note of force or flood, only the cataloguing of differences. Each horizon is both threshold and memory, suspended between what was buried and what remains uncovered. There is a humility, almost, in the refusal to leap from evidence to cause. The shoreline in these records appears and disappears, wandering across the edge of the page. Sometimes its movement is clear, a traced line from one end of the section to the other. Elsewhere, it dissolves into the splay of distributary mouths. The channel's own records the sudden twist. The parted banks confound the habit of slow repositioning. The settlements, faint scores of stone or narrative, mark their own pace. Their drift is slow. They respond to tides, to silt, to governance measured in footsteps and thresholds crossed. But the river mouth here is where the records break stride. It reorganizes, not in sequence, but in apparent leaps, as if the land had reconsidered itself during a quiet, unrecorded night. Now, the section lies open, bare to the drifting dust. Pamphlets of sediment, friable at the edges, yield to air and boot tread. The summer wind moves over the cut, scattering fragments of older horizons. The evidence is arrayed, but still unfinished, marked, sampled, labelled, yet never fully reassembled. What remains is partial, fragmented, accepted only in pieces. The line between order and interruption is drawn over and over, never quite holding to the surface. Memory here gathers, as sediment does a drift and lull, an accretion of traces and hesitations. You begin at the margin. The ancient harbour wall, stones once shaped by slow hands and levelled to the line where water would pause. There is an assumption, spoken quietly in records, drawn with steady tools in the notebooks of earlier surveyors. The threshold is where the sea admits vessels, where harbour, master and merchant both agree. Here is safe anchorage. Here the tide crests and falls according to the measure known for generations. Harbour walls, thresholds written into stone and sealed in tradition, are said to reflect the choreography of local tides. The best practices for safe haven. That is the belief one inherits, dusty but persistent, whenever the stones are faced and the recesses traced with slow fingers. You are told, or perhaps you tell yourself, that these thresholds are opposite numbers to the wanderings of the water's edge. It intrudes softly, almost apologetically, the way a line in a ledger contradicts a memory. In the cool shade between blocks, close savants begin to notice a pattern of marks not matching expectation along the ancient masonry. At set elevations, there are bands sometimes darkened, sometimes roughened by encrustation. Marine growth clings where, by all reckoning, it should not. The encrustation levels are not parallel to the mean tide, not in agreement with the figures carried forward from tidal logs, nor with the predictable progression captured in modern hydrological surveys. Instead, the notches, some sharp, some blurred by time, interrupt the logic left for those who would interpret them. The seawater rises and recedes, but these notches keep their own silent marks, asking the observer to set aside the chart, just for a moment, and consider their stubborn difference. There are architectural drawings, yellowed at the edges and held flat by careful hands, where these notches are traced faithfully in graphite and ink. Each notch has its place in the record. A certain elevation marked, a discrete intrusion mapped on stone, whose weathering elsewhere is otherwise even and unremarkable. Next to the architectural phase labels, set out in their neat sequence, are dry observations. Colonization by particular species, barnacles clustering just above or below the water's remembered line, layers of algae or lichen indicating prior inundation and later exposure. Conservation reports, modelled for objectivity, preserve these data with restraint. No theory, only observation, the bands noted. Somewhere a pen rests beside the page. The evidence accumulates, asking for patience. It is easy to wish for an answer. The evidence insists on its neutrality, offering only what is observable. Notch elevations do not align with the calculated range of past tides reconstructed from silt and orbital mechanics. The phase labels in the stonework masonry added, repaired, repointed, do not coincide with the spread of incrustation, nor with the marine colonization expected at those times. The record keepers do not comment further. Instead, the gap persists. The engineer's measured waterfront seems tailored to a waterline regime no longer visible to us. one that resists the easy application of later imaginings. The lines cut in stone at times coincide with marine occupation, at times drift above or below, as if remembering a different sea altogether. Somewhere, in the layering of reports, a kind of silence settles in. The imprint of salt is present, but the narrative does not coalesce. The observer stands, sometimes alone, sometimes among sketches and digital scans, fingers tracing rough transitions from wet to dry, following the memory of water that was, or might have been. You find yourself noticing a certain choreography in the evidence, the way bands of marine life mirror, but never quite match, the notches, the way stone, once submerged, now sits arid, but never loses the residue of that past relationship. Questions remain beneath the catalogued details. A tidal range reconstructed on paper floats above the physical testimony preserved in stone. For a moment, the order of things wavers. What came first? The mark or the water? Was the wall always meant to receive the tide here? Or has the sea, in its quiet persistence, each element, encrustation, notch, phase label, is given space to endure, its position fixed, but its implication never fully defined? The engineered waterfront appears as an echo of practices adapted not only to a line of wet or dry, but to a sequence of need, misremembered or transformed by the passage of time. Stones are saturated once, then left to the sun and wind. The notch is neither erased nor explained, but remains an index of something paused between one regime and the next. All around, there is the slow drift of dust, the patient erosion of certainty, and the architecture of memory overlaid by the silence of not knowing. The evidence outlives the hands that built and the eyes that first measured. You are, in the end, left with the persistence of marks, levels, and bands, offering no resolution, only the quiet provocation of their presence. It is easy, often, to take the silence between seasons as a kind of certainty. The old order, established under open air and constellations, is thought to anchor the cycles of cultivation. Soils are broken when the ground softens, seeds pressed deep in expectation, then amber fields cut, threshed, gathered as shadows lengthen. The assumption is a cord stretched quietly from past to present, a belief that the hands which sorted chaff from grain in one generation taught the same pulse of harvest to the next. The record charred remnants of seeds, the spectral outline of crops combined and recombined across centuries, promises continuity, that a bin filled, a field emptied, a calendar inscribed quietly at the turn of a lunar phase, mark threads unbroken. There is comfort in a pattern that neither falters nor drifts. Yet the record interrupts itself. You see it first not in the expected monuments, but in the slim residues teased from ash and silt, in the layers where fire preserved its losses. The pattern is not newly revealed but unsettled from within. There, in the blackened kernels and fragments sifted from an abandoned hearth, grains tell a sequence that runs askew. The catalogues note a shifting geometry of seed maturation, larger, softer husks, or an unexpected planing of the grain surface, where scarring signals earlier harvest. Some heads are clipped before fullness, some left to dry beyond customary heat, the weed species always trailing the sown crops, always an echo of tending or neglect cluster, in ratios that resist the usual readings of season. Their presence is not explained, only documented, coded into context. A series of digits and abbreviations filed for recall. You peruse the lists, notations of ubiquity, context codes echoing faintly against the neutral lattice of the archive. There is no hypothesis submitted. The reports lean into restraint, describing species, measuring grain, noting the pale signature of fire on outer husk. Assemblages are mapped to temporary bins, referenced by locus, sample, provenience, never by narrative. Grain size, inflorescence, scars, weed assemblage. The trinity recurred and measured, but always held at arm's length. No line drawn between evidence and explanation, only description repeated until it quiets the urge to resolve. This is not absence. It is the silent accumulation of detail that does not congeal into cause. The occupational horizon narrows. What the archive charts is not the usual expansion but a constriction, a tightened window in time where routines falter. The expectation is a broad curve, an arc of harvest steady in its field, organizing both hands and horizons. Here, the curve flattens, edges sharpen, grain collected not at the moment of ripeness but before or after, out of sequence. The silent record of labor baskets, bins, fields, marks, nothing. These are not disruptions written in text or spoken word, but imprinted quietly, where the archaeobotanist strains to draw breath from carbon and dust. The calendar, once a tacit partner to work, slips. No agronomic cause is offered, nor need be. Files remain silent on drought, on pest, on procession or uproar. Only the seed record, spooling forward, registers this mute deviation. What fields once expected the metronome of sun and moon, of tide and touch and careful counting is thrown askance. The organization of labor, so often mapped in the steady repetition of sow and reap, can no longer be tracked with the detachment of archived codes. The ordinary cool of abandoned hearths and the echo where bins stand hollow speak in tandem, a chorus of void, not of event. You read through the neutral description, the catalogue species, the percentages and contexts, moving quietly across them again. The work of record keepers is careful, restrained. There is an implicit longing in the precision, the hope that accumulation, thoroughness, and clarity might one day resolve these patterns into sense. Yet the silence of motive, of weather or necessity, presses in. Shadows collect in informational gaps, in the refusal of evidence to align precisely with practice. Scarred grain, too large or too small, collected never quite at the hour expected. Weeds, neither purely adventitious nor entirely deliberate, seeded in between and among. Each line read is a quiet admission that something no longer matches seasons themselves, flickering out of anticipated order. Still, the process turns. Soils sifted, evidence weighed. All that was left in fire remains neutral, unswayed. The archival voice lists, collates, and does not suppose. You move past the bins, feeling the cool where heat once simmered, the light absence of stored grain, the memory of organization unmoored. Which season did the seeds refuse to keep? It is an old expectation, quietly inherited and rarely spoken, that graves, once begun, follow one ancient thread. The bodies are turned, aligned, fixed by tradition or by a cosmological design that has scarcely been questioned. The compasses are taken out. A steady hand measures the azimuth, and one assumes without much noise that the ritual is continuous, unmoved by the passage of years, undisturbed by momentary doubts or the minor irregularities of practice. The East calls them all, or so the narrative runs beneath the surface. East, the promise presumed in every excavation by those who arrive long after the earth has settled. Yet beneath this layer of expectation, there is resistance, a looseness, quietly persistent, revealed only in the collected field sheets, in the burial plans, in the silent accumulation of records. The neat lines of graves are not as steady as the assumption would wish them to be. The data says as much, never arguing, never raising its voice, only recording, in sequence, from tomb to tomb, from the earliest interment to the last. The bearings shift, just a little at first. Not all lie on a common thread. The compass lines do not quite match the map's grid. From one grave to the next, the azimuths move in phase, like a drift caught only by the attentive, by the diligent notemakers, by the archivists of dust and shadow. As the field sheets pile and the plans accrue detail, the regularity promised by the old assumption is quietly undone. There is movement in the silent data. Each grave, each record, marks out a moment suspended now in the memory of soil and stone. The observer stands at the threshold of a tomb, the soil peeled back, the long silence of the earth broken. Only the position remains, skull turning slightly one way, shoulders angled, toes tracing a line that is measured, recorded, given a number. Bearings are logged, sometimes in trembling graphite, sometimes in blue ink fading with time. The observer notes the shape of the pit, the slumping of walls, the angle of repose. The skeletal forms resolve into coordinates, dissolving the memory of ritual into a series of compass readings, each one distinct, each one subject to the Earth's gentle unpredictability. No assertion is made about why the graves lean, why they tip forward or back, or why East itself grows restless beneath their forms. The evidence is too composed, its message too understated. Instead, the field sheets offer only the measurements. 76 degrees, 79, 82. A subtle procession unfolding across decades. Never acknowledged in the moment of burial, but witnessed now by the precise indifference of record keepers. Each line is drawn, arrow slipping across paper. Each skeleton is listed, flexed, extended, supine, lateral. Grave goods catalogued an object here, a number there, iron in the dust. The inventory grows, but there is no diagnosis. Silence thickens between description and explanation. What remains is a pattern that is not quite a pattern, a regularity always just out of reach. The graves are closed now. The ritual moment passed into the unrecorded hours of a different century. Dirt settles. Shadows shift. The horizon that might once have been marked, or watched, or simply noticed, is lost to the records. All that endures is the phase of the azimuth, the slight turn, the bearing that gives no reason and confesses no origin. No signpost remains to tell us which point on the horizon called the dead to turn their faces, only the numbers, patient and unresolved. Each grave opens and closes in memory. The data persists, quiet, inexorable. Record after record accumulates not as evidence of certainty, but as evidence of process, of gentle divergence, of ritual without declaration. The archivist's silence is as present as the bodies themselves, bodies that do not speak but allow the living to read. And every reading is held in abeyance, an invitation to see, to measure, but not to declare. The archive remains untouched by diagnosis, abstaining from ritual claims, even as each bearing, each skeletal position, each inventory number quietly suggests there is something more. Just out of reach, just beyond the horizon marked by the original act. A ritual that responds perhaps, or a horizon event unrelenting, or simply the accumulation of years, frost, memory, and silence. The cemetery is mapped, and yet it is unmappable. Each grave a closed question, the compass line a lingering gesture. Knowing only what is given. What, after all, did those dead face when their bodies were laid down? It has long been permitted quietly, without parade or proclamation, to read the maps of ceramic distribution as charts of reliability, to peer at the scatter of pottery recovered across soil and brush, to count headlands and valleys, and to imagine, confidently, a network stitched smooth by routine passage, the coast unbroken, the tracks beneath low scrub remaining passable in even the shallowest night, and trade routes undisturbed by transient winds or the troubled waters of a single season. There was always a comfort in this pattern. The wares, whether coarse or glazed, coastal or inland, modified only by the habit of established exchange and the slow turn of need. Not by the brief rise or fall of a river, not by the sharp retreat of a tide. So the expectation, constancy, gradualness, steadiness embedded as faith in the archaeological record. The roots do not flicker with every drought, do not fracture at every storm, do not vanish with each shifting sandbank or restless current. The maps as evidence of refusal of chaos, refusal of haste. This understanding draped across decades, repeated in low-voiced conference rooms and margins of dig reports, as if each sherd marked not just a vessel but a vow against interruption. Yet it is the evidence, subtle but cumulative, that murmurs of another movement. Not a shout, though no less disturbing for its restraint. The ratio changes, sherd to sherd, vessel to vessel. The count of fragments from the coast grows thin, while the inland wares fill their horizon with a different weight, a different light. These are not wounds torn suddenly in the record, no visible rupture, only the quiet accumulation of difference at the edges of context numbers, within the breath between catalogue scribbles, among the unremarked sketches on provenience sheets. Horizons, tightly dated, unyielding, lay their testimony with the detachment of the truly neutral observer. The evidence refuses to elaborate, yet it multiplies. The count of catalogued forms, the silent metrics of tallied rims and bases, the slow arithmetic of inventory sheets stacking without flourish. The change settles in the proportions, not in pronouncements. Nothing declaims the cause. The records, impartial to the logic of afterthought, allow the possibility to grow in the silence between their lines. One is returned, repeatedly, to the table by the window, late in afternoon light, where sherds are shuffled in careful hands. The registry of context numbers is precise, never expressive. The handwriting does not sway as the wares shift from salt-rimed to red-earthed, as fabrics are analysed grain by grain, clay by slip, region by temper. The repetition is deliberate, never mundane. You linger on a vessel's shoulder, not for its beauty, but for the silt that encrusts its fired body, making an inland origin more probable, more plausible, though not confirmed. Another line is drawn in the catalogue. Entry follows entry, each numbered but none interpreted. Coastline and upland, margin and hollow, lines which have shifted, imperceptibly or not at all, which was stable, which dissolved. No certainty. The wares observed coastal slips receding, inland fabrics emerging remain as data, not explanation. And so the tension persists, not in the facts, but in what quietly refuses to be named. Is this movement in the numbers solely the product of need, of taste, of the predictable calculations of human preference pressed into the earth each generation? Or is there the wilder possibility, rarely spoken, never settled, that the world itself rearranged the table, roots rerouted, not by consensus or order, but by the unnoticed closure of a watercourse, the slow narrowing of a passage, the faint but unignorable rise or fall in navigable windows? The sea draws back, or some bay's mouth silts over, and the crates, sturdy but mute, are stacked in warehouses, their destination now quiet, their overseers left to watch pathways empty overnight. Where once a coastal amphora rolled from hull to cart, a different vessel now arrives, dustier, rough-edged, shaped by the distance of inland tracks. The maps, formal and neutral, simply note the shift without commentary. In the archives, in the rooms of silence, you trace the lines without remarking upon the hands that once shifted pots from one crate to another, or the silence that follows when the routes no longer hum with passage. It gives only numbers, sources, dates, and the clipped vocabulary of neutral description. The registry holds fabric analyses without hypothesis, catalogue entries without a why. You linger among boxes of sherds, stacked as if waiting for a conclusion that will never arrive, their only testimony a shift in proportion, a silence that has replaced the commerce of centuries. What passage, closed or opened, made the pots move differently? It has often been assumed, quietly, with the confidence that comes from patterned repetition, that animal remains mingled within layers of refuse reflect a certain stability, a constancy in human need, exploitation, and the pulse of the local ecology. These bones and fragments, embedded in time's sediment, are interpreted as residuals of enduring practice, evidence of day traversing into another day, hunts undertaken, animals selected, discarded remnants charting a steady course between resource and residual, old midden, layered and silent now, supposedly bears witness to habits that neither night nor uncertainty could change. The accepted view rests gently on that continuity, the idea that what is left behind remains legible, and that its patterns translate into rhythms lived and repeated. But then there is what unsettles. The archive, when opened again, produces a quiet dissonance, a gentle disturbance cycling through the catalogued remains. The evidence does not arrive as an intrusion, but as a gradual, accumulating shift in balance. Record sheets start to note not merely the familiar daylight animals, but something else. The relative frequency of nocturnal species, subtle at first, then present enough to be undeniable, emerges in the occupation layers. Bones marked by the passage of both predator and tool, wings and feet, jaws and vertebrae from creatures whose presence leans toward the night. The distinction is not dramatic, but it is persistent. The pattern, once smooth, develops an undertow. Each faunal list logged, each taphonomic annotation reasserts the anomaly. Hands record the counts. More bones from those whose day is the darkness, preserved in the strata's slow drift. You sense this shift, not in the dramatic, but in the enduring repetition. Drawer after drawer in the storeroom, bags labelled with context and context again, each offering up a portion of the nocturnal. In the ledger, there are only numbers and names, yet a shape forms in the accumulation. The stable baseline gives way, ever so slightly. Here, a greater proportion of owl pellet fragments. There, the curved jaw of a small burrowing mammal, interrupted by cut marks meticulously tallied in the margins of the register. Neutral in presentation, indifferent to speculation. The observers record only what the remains themselves allow to be recorded. Species identifications, frequencies by skeletal element, distribution through the stratigraphy, and the impression of human intervention left as brief tallies, cuts, splits, traces, scored surfaces. No narrative voice enters the catalogue. The evidence stands uneasily in its enclosure of numbers and lists, resistant to easy translation. In the lab's hush, under the task lamps, the remains are emptied of assertion. Their forms await arrangement. Each item is described, never explained. Familiarity hovers, but is left unspoken, a memory of stable patterns now unsettled by the growing presence of the nocturnal. The cut marks do not align with a single interpretation. Some appear intentional, some ambiguous, some altogether silent. Silence, here, operates not as an absence, but as a veil, a restraint that holds the questions at bay, even as they accumulate. The notation of frequency, the cold enumeration, offers neither guidance nor closure. Outside the evidence, you are offered only the surface of possibility. Does the change reflect a shift in those who process these remains, an alteration in the schedules and rhythms that separated night from day, work from rest? Or did the fauna alter their own behaviors, straying into new cycles or exposures, redrawing the lines of predation and proximity within the ecological theatre? The records are steadfastly mute on such matters. No behavioral argument intrudes. Only the pattern alters, and the archival process endures. Sometimes there is the faintest echo ash, once hot, now cold at the basin of the hearth. In the midden, the remains are pressed together. Daylight and darkness layered in silence. Hands that sift through this refuse become accidental witnesses, not interpreters. The work of description does not attempt to reconstruct intention or cause. It catalogues, measures, records, and pauses. What is left, after the facts and the tallies, is the sense of a boundary, moved one that once divided, night from work, rest from reaping, separation from overlap. If the inhabitants of this place redrew that line, or if it was the animals themselves that shifted the pattern, the evidence keeps it secret. The ash is cold and the midden sleeps. No conclusion is permitted, only the return of quiet observation. The lists contain only what was found, not why. In the slow rhythm of counting, describing, annotating, the past resists closure. The silence endures, as the shadow between what is visible and what is left unsaid stretches undisturbed. In this stillness, amid dust and catalogue, one question abides. What moved the boundary between night and work for those who left these remains? There is a comfort, almost a necessity, in patterns. In laboratory halls and along the brittle edge of enamel, the quiet expectation lingers. That tooth enamel, layer by layer, encodes within its crystalline lattice a record of the seasons, a calendar of childhood's hidden meals, and the cyclic pulse of distant landscapes. You are told to believe that with each growth, each accretion, isotopic ratios settle predictably, legible as the tides of earth and sky. Oxygen and carbon, measured in their subtle increments, are thought to reflect a child's seasons. They whisper of what was eaten, what was drunk, and by extension, the world that wrapped itself around growing bone. You are told that if you read the enamel correctly, the years will unfold with the same calm regularity as the forest's rings or the river's quiet rise and fall. Consistency is assumed, the world repeats itself, past echoing future, in quiet, unbroken measure. The enamel, once resting invisibly behind closed mouths, is summoned now in fragments and slabs. Across sterile benches the work proceeds. The samples arrive as catalogue entries, each tooth assigned a code, each code a silent door into lives already concluded. There is sample 0037, traced with the micromill, a thin path delicately carved along the surface. There is sample 0215, logged 3 years ago, chipped at its core. The laboratory logs hold only what can be seen. 0037, enamel, transect, 1A, delta 1, 8, O negative, 9.7, delta 1, 3C, negative 14.2, 0037, enamel, transect, 1B, delta 1, 8, O, negative, 7.4, delta 1, 3C, negative 13.7D, 0215, enamel, transect, 2C, delta 1, 8, O negative 12.1E, delta 1, 3C, negative 15.4E. Numbers that do not shift with the seasons as the regional baselines predict. The expectations stratified, cyclical, reliable fractures. The measured cycles, if present, are ambiguous, displaced, or vanish altogether. Winter and summer dissolve into one another. Or perhaps the sequence is inverted. The enamel records a rhythm, but it is not the rhythm written elsewhere. Those who record, who grind and drill and log, do not annotate, surprise. The logbooks remain neutral, preserving only dates, IDs, values. Sample 0037, prepared under clean hood. Transects, milled to 80 micron depth. Values calibrated with international reference. The datasets expand in quiet columns of isotope data, chromatograms devoid of commentary. These markers, once meant to tie living children to their environment, now unfasten from expectation. You are left with the simple act of observation. The enamel's profile, archived as a strip of values, no longer fits snugly into the climate archives built from tree rings, from ice, from sediments sleeping at the bottoms of lakes. Here, the seasons falter. Here, the cycle that ought to pattern itself upon childhood experience reflects an unregistered pulse. You know only the shape of the record, not its cause. The cases accumulate without crescendo. The enamel is filed away. Glass vials in padded drawers. The micromilled powders, grains nearly invisible, lie dormant beside the dentine, untouched, silent within their catalogue containers. The absence of explanation hangs in the air, no heavier than dust. The laboratory's lights dim around you, leaving logs open, lines unfilled. But the record remains impassive, granular and uncaring. The teeth persist. There are no voices to interpret them, only numbers arranged in patient segments. The evidence does not rush. Repeat the process, again and again. Clean the bit, check the depth, note the readings. It is routine, crafted by habit, watchful but distanced. With each entry, the pattern is both invoked and deferred. You open the sample, measure, refile. A pattern is implied but never landed upon. Instead, the conflict lingers. The idea that childhood seasons, its warmth and cold, its crops and hungers may have diverged, bent toward unnoticed rhythms lost to every other archive. Regional baselines are silent, the global patterns untroubled, but in the teeth, a local cycle stakes its subtle claim, resistant to translation. Or perhaps there is no cycle at all, only noise, only the consequences of time and mineral, a silence in enamel. There is no narrative in these logs, only preservation. As you close the drawer, rubber tips sealing glass, as you align catalog codes in shadowed cabinets, you return to that quiet, familiar space where evidence waits. Observers retreat. Findings are neither affirmed nor denied. Possibility remains suspended, not by assertion, but by absence. There is no conclusion. The teeth do not tell. Dentine, mute and unyielding, keeps its counsel beneath polished, pale surfaces. Silence lingers along the laboratory corridors, echoing long after the work is finished. Which cycle impressed itself on those growing teeth? It is generally assumed, in the practice of harbour and quay investigation, that the timbers lying submerged beneath the shifting line, where water meets land, are reliable witnesses to their own beginning. Each timber is said to hold ring upon ring the tentative shape of its year of felling, its emplacement in soft mud, its entry into usefulness. There is a cadence in the story of the submerged pile. First the cut, then the sinking, then the long embrace with dark water, where marine life attends by ancient schedule, tracing familiar paths along the grain, and the colonization of these timbers progresses in the widely anticipated rhythms of unveering tide and season. The assumption persists quietly that to observe timber, to map its state of preservation and record its companions, these barnacles, these shipworms, these scattered marks, will be to read a history as regular as tides, as certain as the return of the salt air. A series of piles is discovered, their forms half-sheared from the ancient silt, their surfaces marked in ways that deny reassurance. The wood is harder in the grip than might be expected, edges worn but not smooth, the split grain carrying not the touch of the usual marine tide, but a scattered, wandering pockmarking. Boreholes cluster oddly, neither patterned by the established routines of known borer taxa, nor truly random. Certain areas of each timber reveal a preserved horizon, a distinct boundary below which colonization is intense above. A silence. Conservation reports tie their language tightly to what can be seen. Ring counts noted in the log, identification by species in dry ink, the measured enumeration of borings present, and accession numbers beside the genus name of each interloper. There is a pause in the archive here, a reluctance to assert more than the wood and the data can bear. No scenario is set forth, no neat maritime sequence imposed. Instead, the written record remains in its most neutral aspect. The number of rings from base to bark, the identity of the timber by genus and date, and most notably, the absence or density of marine borer tunnels preserved along each face. Sometimes, a barnacle cluster persists just above the point where the timber was driven deepest. At other times, only empty sockets where some mollusk once bored. Dendrochronology samples are laid out a thin slice cut from core to sapwood, the math of age compressing centuries into millimeters. The piles are raised out of their element, exposed in the grey light, as if the damp residue of the tidal past could be weighed. Each scraping of barnacle shell echoes the absence of water, a threshold past. The wood dries brusquely, fibres separating, as if the memory of immersion is seeping away. The friction between what is preserved and what is expected marks out a silence. Why do the boreholes climb and then stop, abrupt, against an invisible level? Where are the records of the tides that shaped these patterns? To observe this is to linger in the uncertainty, counting the same features again and again. Granular surface, depth of colonization, absence of particular taxa where they should have been in abundance. The marine borer counts, entered methodically, betray a mild unease. The sequence does not match the recorded tidal advances logged elsewhere on similar harbours. The ring counts, always finite, line up beside accession numbers, silent but for their difference. Species identifications, returned from reference labs, hold no surprise. Only the subtle inertia of expectation not quite fulfilled. There lingers the sense that timing has misaligned, that access to water and the coming of shipworms and barnacles did not converge upon these piles by the ordinary laws of tidal return. Its surface exposed to air for the first time in decades or centuries. Observers with brushes and chisels scrape away the barnacles, flake by flake, preserving as much as can be kept intact, recording in the margin the altitude of each deposit, the roughness of the shell. The wood, once saturated, begins to fissure at the margins. The evidence remains, a line of demarcation between intense, boring and untouched wood. A residue of interrupted colonization. The observers note it in their ledgers, make sketches in the margins. The accession numbers catalogued under borrowed lamplight do not offer clarity, only the assurance that this confusion, too, is now part of the official record. The pile, drying, with its cluster of boreholes diminished, takes on the texture of an artifact newly estranged from its own context. Still, the reports do not assert an interpretation. They accumulate layers of uncertainty page by page, as if the absence of explanation were evidence itself. There is a cyclical refrain in returning to these piles. Before and after, then and now, water and air. The timber remains, raised from silence, presented for measurement, then returned to rest in storage or display. The only clarity is in what remains, what is measured, counted, removed and stored. When did the tide last meet the horizon marked in silent timber, assumptions pressed down, silent and reassuring, until they aren't? It is assumed, here along the pale exposure, where the coast holds its own story against wind and water, that the grooves cut into the bedrock are familiar. They belong, it is said, to a category functional, perhaps, or decorative, assigned to the habits and needs of those once here. Purpose is defaulted to the local and durable, some necessary mark, some recurring craft, something that made sense in the economy of days along this shore. The bedrock remains exposed, marked with lines that suggest intention grounded in stability. Assumptions do not shake at first. They live in repetition. Yet, beneath the quiet order of theory, there is a slow encroachment, measured not in suspicion, but in accumulation. There is a particular series, understated, parallel incisions, slightly deeper in places, their courses echoing one against another in patient regularity. Each groove distances itself from its neighbours precisely, set in an orientation that, at first glance, might be mapped to some routine or economy of movement, an arm's length, a body's span, a tool's sweep. But on second approach, slower, more deliberate, their positions begin to persist beyond the habitual and drift toward the improbable. The records hold these grooves without presumption. Survey notebooks, thick with notations and silent narratives, bear witness to the process. Groove spacing measured at 7.2 centimeters central, orientation south-southwest, azimuth, 197 degrees. Meteorological recordings of the day note a brisk salt wind, annotations in the margins, in pencil barely resisting the smear of time and handling, remark only on the visibility of horizon markers. The descriptions accumulate stone context unaltered, weathered surface unbroken, but for these incisions, no apparent repair or re-engraving, no interruptions save a minor infilling of lichen and wind-shifted dust. Each data point enters the archive without judgment. Azimuths are compared, distances checked, elevations recorded with the patience of the record keeper. Parallelism is itself a subject of measurement. There is a correspondence, one that does not shout, but rather lingers, a way in which the grooves seem tethered not just to each other, but to something farther, something shifting. Surveyors' compasses, brought to the site again and again, return the same measurements. Against the frame of the distant horizon, the grooves seem to align. Not every observer sees it at first. The marks could be ordinary, could have remained ordinary, but for the quiet friction of another pattern. Their spacing, their orientation, when transcribed onto tracing paper and carried down the shore, echo calculations for the extremes of lunar declination. The moon's course is not fixed. Its rhythm presses upon the tides, upon the shoreline itself. Extremes are calculated and entered in a hand not prone to conjecture. Maximum southern, minimum northern, intervals mapped against the horizon, where markers rock outcrops, the broken spine of a drift log were noted long ago. The groove becomes more than a simple artifact. It is not announced as ritual, nor dismissed entirely as mere utilitarian habit. Its presence is heavy with reference, yet mute. Where intention might press forward, the evidence holds austerely back. There are measurements, there are records, there is stone, nothing more. It is only in the repetition of documentation, the return of the observer, the hesitance of the archival voice, that a faint disturbance emerges. The practice of cutting into stone might be assumed as static, anchored in tool, skill, or tradition. Here, however, the consistency of the marks exists in tension with the instability of what they appear to reference. A celestial arc, a tidal edge, shifting all the while, refusing to hold still beneath the weight of stone. To witness is not to infer. The groove remembers. The groove is compelled to repeat itself, yet its orientation betrays change. How is stillness scored upon a surface when the reference point itself recedes like the moon to the invisible horizon? Memory does not yield clear answers among these intervals. The stone remains, warmed by sun and then cooled beneath cloud, a surface that buffers its own secrets. To step barefoot over these grooves is to feel the insensible transition from radiant heat to the neutrality of shade, from the certainty of present stone to the pervasive absence of explanation. Marks persist while their cause dissolves. Later, perhaps, a trace of salt gathers in the deepest cut, an accidental preservation. The neutral, observed, and catalogued remain in tension with the implied. No conclusion settles over the record. Even the act of looking back, recapturing the angle of the sun, the placement of horizon markers, the register of lunar possibility, does not restore the intention, only the shape of loss. The grooves are inscribed, remain measured, and are returned to, but no certainty emerges. What event did those grooves try to score into rock? You have followed dust and clay, stone and record. The silence returns in a different shape. The evidence does not resolve, it asks. The inheritance is not a story to finish, but a ledger to hold. Measurements, erasures, and traces that outlast those who first set them down. We are caretakers of those archives of coral, of mud, of seal, impression, and groove. Reflect on what you would keep, what you would measure, and what you would leave unread. If you linger with this as a ritual, subscribe and like in the slow way of witnesses. What will you keep?